The streets of the city buzzed with life, even as the night deepened. Neon lights flickered on storefronts, casting colorful reflections on the rain-soaked pavement. Cars rushed by, their headlights cutting through the darkness, while distant sirens wailed, adding to the symphony of the city's never-ending movement. Inside his aging yellow taxi, Rafik, a middle-aged driver with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting at a red light. It had been a long shift, and exhaustion was settling into his bones. He was just a few rides away from calling it a night when he heard a soft knock on his window. He turned to see a woman, soaking wet from the rain, her face streaked with tears. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, and she shivered in the cold. Something about her sadness unsettled Rafik. He had picked up all kinds of passengers in his years of driving: drunk businessmen, tourists lost in a new city, even couples arguing in the back seat. But this woman, she looked truly broken. Rolling down the window, he hesitated before asking, "Where to?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Just drive, please." Rafik hesitated. His instincts told him this was not an ordinary fare. There was something deeper, something heavy pressing down on this woman. But a job was a job. He unlocked the door, and she slid into the back seat, wrapping her arms around herself. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her eyes distant, lost in thought. The air in the taxi felt thick with unspoken pain. Finally, unable to ignore it, he cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She took a deep breath, but no words came out. Instead, a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. Rafik sighed, focusing back on the road. He didn't know it yet, but this ride was about to change everything. The sound of rain tapping against the windshield filled the silence in the taxi. Rafik stole occasional glances at the woman through the rearview mirror. Her delicate fingers clutched the hem of her coat, her body slightly trembling. She was clearly in distress, but he knew better than to pry. Still, something about her made it hard to look away. He had been driving a taxi for over 15 years, and in that time, he had learned to read people. Some passengers couldn't stop talking, eager to spill their life stories to a stranger they'd never see again. Others were silent, using the ride as a brief escape from their reality. But this woman wasn't just quiet. She was drowning in something invisible, something painful. Finally, he spoke again, his voice gentle. "Miss, I can take you anywhere you need. Are you sure you don't want to tell me where you're going?" The woman sniffled and wiped at her face, hesitating before answering. "I don't know," she murmured. "Just away." Rafik exhaled slowly. Away from what? She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head toward the window, watching as the city lights blurred together in streaks of red, blue, and yellow. Rafik focused on the road, his mind drifting. He thought about his own past, the hardships, the regrets, the nights he had driven aimlessly, trying to escape his own thoughts. Maybe this woman was running from something just like he once had. After several minutes of silence, her voice finally broke through. "Have you ever made a mistake so big that you didn't know if you could ever fix it?" Rafik's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He didn't answer right away. He had made plenty of mistakes in his life, mistakes that had cost him things he could never get back. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "I think everyone has." The woman let out a bitter chuckle. "Not like mine." She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up, showing multiple missed calls and unread messages. She stared at it for a moment before turning it over, as if she couldn't bear to see the notifications. Rafik wasn't sure what had happened to her, but he could see the guilt weighing on her shoulders like a heavy chain. "You know," he said carefully, "sometimes we think our mistakes are bigger than they really are. We carry them like a burden, but most of the time, they don't define us the way we fear they do." She gave a small, sad smile. "You don't even know what I've done." He nodded. "You're right. But I do know that running away never fixes anything." Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror for the first time. There was something there, something fragile and uncertain. Just as she opened her mouth to say something, Rafik's phone rang. The sudden sound made them both jump. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Frowning, he picked up. "Hello." A deep voice on the other end made his breath hitch. "Is this Rafik Khan?" Rafik's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Something about the voice on the other end of the line sent a shiver down his spine. "Yes, this is Rafik Khan," he replied cautiously. "Who is this?" There was a pause, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. Then, the deep voice spoke again. Mr. Khan, this is Inspector Malik from the City Police Department. We need to speak with you immediately. Where are you right now? Rafiq's heart skipped a beat. The police? Why would they be calling him? His eyes darted to the woman in the back seat. She had gone still, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling against her lap. He could see it, the fear creeping back into her eyes. Was this about her? For a moment, Rafiq debated lying, saying he was somewhere else, stalling for time. But he had never been the kind of man who ran from the truth. I'm driving near Clifton Road, he said cautiously. What's this about? There was another pause before Inspector Malik responded. Mr. Khan, this is serious. Do not let your passenger leave. We are tracking her location and will meet you in 5 minutes. Understood. Rafiq's stomach twisted. Tracking her location? His eyes flickered to the woman again. Her gaze was fixed on him, her expression unreadable, but her hands were now clenched into fists. He swallowed hard. Understood, he said, then ended the call. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air inside the taxi grew thick with unspoken tension. Then, in a whisper so soft he almost didn't hear it, the woman said, They're coming for me, aren't they? Rafiq hesitated. Who are you? Her lips parted, but before she could answer, she lunged forward, grabbing his arm. Please, she pleaded. You don't understand. I can't go with them. Rafiq flinched at the desperation in her voice. Tell me what's going on. She shook her head rapidly. There's no time. You have to trust me. Rafiq's thoughts raced. What had he just gotten himself into? He had picked up a crying passenger, and now the police were after her? He had spent years avoiding trouble, living a simple life, driving his taxi, staying out of things that weren't his business. And yet, here he was. I don't even know your name, he murmured. She hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, My name is Aisha. It was the first piece of truth she had given him. But it wasn't enough. The wailing sound of sirens in the distance made Rafiq's pulse spike. The police were close. Aisha's grip on his arm tightened. Please, Rafiq. If you stop this car, I'm finished. Every instinct in him screamed to stay out of it. To pull over, let the police handle whatever this was, and go back to his normal life. And yet, something in Aisha's eyes stopped him. Not just fear. Desperation. He had seen that look before. In the mirror. Years ago, when he had been the one running. The sirens grew louder. Rafiq made his choice. With a sharp turn, he veered off the main road and into a narrow alleyway, tires screeching against the wet pavement. Aisha gasped. What are you doing? Trust me. She let out a breath of relief, but it was quickly replaced by fresh panic. They're tracking me. They'll find us. Rafiq exhaled sharply. Then we need to make sure they find something else. He yanked his phone from its holder and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Then, making another sharp turn, he pulled up beside a small, dimly lit roadside stall. Get out, he said. Aisha's eyes widened. What? Get out, go inside, and wait in the back. Trust me. She hesitated only a second before nodding. Without another word, she slipped out of the taxi and hurried into the stall. Rafiq took a deep breath. Then, gripping the steering wheel tightly, he hit the accelerator and sped back toward the main road, straight toward the oncoming police cars. He was about to lead them away from Aisha. The police sirens grew deafening as Rafiq sped down the road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The headlights of multiple police cars flashed in his rearview mirror, closing in on him fast. His heart pounded. What the hell was he doing? He could have just handed Aisha over. He could have let the police take care of whatever this was. But something inside him wouldn't let him. As the first police vehicle pulled up alongside him, a voice blasted from a loudspeaker. Rafiq Khan. Pull over immediately. Rafiq's jaw clenched. He had no plan. No idea where this road would take him. But one thing was clear. He had to get the police off Aisha's trail. With a sudden jerk of the wheel, he swerved onto a side street, nearly clipping a parked motorcycle. A honking truck swerved to avoid him, barely missing his taxi. The police weren't giving up. They were right on his tail. He had seconds to decide his next move. Think, Rafiq. Think. His mind raced. The city was a maze of roads, alleys, and shortcuts. He had been driving these streets for years. He knew every hidden turn, every dead end. And then it hit him. The old bridge. It had been under construction for months. Traffic was blocked off, and no one used it anymore. But there was a narrow path, just wide enough for a taxi to squeeze through. If he could get there, he might just have a chance. He slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the taxi to its limit. The speedometer climbed. 60, 70, 80 kilometers per hour. The police cars followed, sirens blaring. The bridge came into view. Metal barriers blocked the entrance, warning signs flashing in the dim light. Too late to turn back now. Gritting his teeth, Rafik aimed for the narrowest gap between the barriers and gunned it. The taxi scraped through with inches to spare. Sparks flew as metal screeched against metal. He made it through, but the police weren't so lucky. The first patrol car slammed on its brakes, unable to fit through the gap. The second swerved to avoid it, crashing into a pile of construction materials. Rafik didn't stop to see the damage. His taxi sped across the unfinished bridge, the tires bouncing against uneven concrete. The city lights blurred past him. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the road ahead opened up. He was free. For now. Rafik didn't slow down until he was miles away. Only then did he finally pull over, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His hands were shaking. He had just led the police on a chase. He had just broken the law to protect a woman he didn't even know. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. What the hell had he just done? His thoughts snapped back to Aisha. She was still waiting. He had to go back. Checking his mirrors to make sure no one had followed him, he turned the taxi around and took a longer, quieter route back to the roadside stall where he had left her. As he pulled up, his stomach twisted. She was gone. Rafik's heart slammed against his ribs. Aisha was gone. He jumped out of the taxi, his eyes scanning the darkened street. The roadside stall was still there, its flickering bulb casting weak light on the empty benches. But there was no sign of her. Had the police found her? Had she run away? He cursed under his breath. He should never have left her alone. What are you looking for? Rafik turned sharply. The tea vendor was staring at him, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. The woman I left here, Rafik said urgently. Where is she? The vendor squinted at him. She left a while ago. Looked scared. Kept looking around like someone was after her. Rafik felt a chill run down his spine. Did she say anything? The vendor took a slow drag of his cigarette, then gestured toward the table. She left this. Rafik stepped forward and saw a small folded piece of paper. His fingers trembled as he picked it up and unfolded it. They found me. I'm sorry. Don't look for me. Aisha. His stomach sank. This wasn't over. Rafik closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He could leave. Walk away from all of this. He had already risked everything for a stranger. But something inside him refused to let go. Aisha had been terrified. Someone was hunting her. And now, she was out there alone. Rafik crumpled the note in his fist. Not on my watch. He got back into his taxi and started driving, his mind racing. Where would she go? She had no phone. No money. She was running from someone dangerous. His only clue was what she had said before, something about needing to leave the city. That meant the bus station. He swerved onto the main road, heading straight for the inner-city terminal. When he arrived, the place was packed with late-night travelers. He parked haphazardly and jumped out, scanning the crowds. Come on, Aisha. Where are you? His eyes flicked to the ticket counters. A row of people waited in line, clutching their bags. Aisha wasn't among them. He checked the waiting area. Nothing. His frustration grew. He was running out of time. Then, out of the corner of his eye, a flash of familiar clothing. Aisha. She was standing near the entrance, her back pressed against a pillar, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked terrified, glancing around as if expecting someone to grab her. And then, Rafik saw them. Two men. They were moving through the crowd, their eyes scanning every face. One of them pulled out his phone, muttering something to the other. Aisha had seen them too. Her whole body went rigid. She turned to run. Rafik didn't think, he just moved. He pushed through the crowd, shoving past people. Aisha darted toward the exit, but the men had spotted her. One of them lunged. Too slow. Rafik reached her first. Come with me, he hissed, grabbing her wrist. She gasped but didn't resist. They ran. He led her through the station, weaving between people, past vendors and baggage carts. Shouts rang out behind them. The men were chasing them now. Rafik's heart pounded. He had to think fast. He yanked Aisha toward the parking lot. His taxi was parked near the exit. He fumbled for his keys as they reached the car. Aisha scrambled into the passenger seat. The men were closing in. Rafiq jumped behind the wheel, turned the ignition, and slammed the accelerator. The tires screeched. The taxi shot forward. In the rearview mirror, the men stood there, watching them speed away. Their faces were filled with rage. And something worse. They weren't giving up. Rafiq tightened his grip on the wheel. Neither was he. The taxi sped through the dark streets, the city lights blurring past. Rafiq stole a glance at Aisha. She was shaking, her fingers digging into the seat. "Who are they?" he asked, voice firm. Aisha swallowed hard. "People I was never supposed to escape from." Rafiq gritted his teeth. He had figured as much. But now, with those men knowing his taxi, his face, he had stepped into something he couldn't just drive away from. They had to disappear. "Now, I need to get you somewhere safe," Rafiq said, taking a sharp turn onto a quieter road. Aisha hesitated. "There's no safe place. They'll find me." Rafiq thought fast. His own home was out of the question. His neighborhood was too open, too easy to track. But then he remembered an abandoned construction site on the city outskirts. Years ago, he had picked up a night watchman from there. The place had been left unfinished for years. No one would look for them there. He turned onto a dirt road leading to the site. Broken cement slabs, rusted metal rods, and empty scaffolding loomed in the dim glow of his headlights. "We stay here for a few hours," he said. "They'll be searching the bus station first." Aisha didn't argue. She was exhausted. Rafiq killed the engine and sat back, listening to the eerie silence. The city felt a world away, but something still nagged at him. "What do they want from you, Aisha?" he asked. She took a deep breath, hesitating before whispering. "I know something I wasn't supposed to know." Rafiq turned to face her fully. "They killed my father." His chest tightened. "Who did?" She looked at him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "A businessman, someone powerful. My father was an accountant at his company. He found out about illegal dealings, tried to expose them, and then he was gone. They said it was an accident, but I found his files. They weren't accidents, Rafiq. They were murders." A cold shiver ran down Rafiq's spine. "You have proof?" Aisha nodded. "And that's why they want me dead." Before Rafiq could respond, a sound cut through the night. Engines. Approaching fast. His stomach clenched. They had found them. Headlights beamed through the broken windows. Two black SUVs rumbled onto the site, engines growling. Aisha gasped. Rafiq reached for her hand. "Run." They bolted. Ducking behind the half-built walls, they ran through the skeletal remains of the building. Boots thudded against the gravel behind them. Then, a gunshot. Aisha screamed. A bullet ricocheted off the concrete inches from them. Rafiq pulled her down behind a steel beam. His heart pounded. "There's no way out." Aisha whispered, terrified. Rafiq's mind raced. The only way to survive this was to turn the tables. He looked around, the scaffolding. The men were spreading out, flashlights sweeping the area. Rafiq grabbed Aisha's hand. "We climb." They scrambled up the rusted metal bars, reaching a narrow platform above. Below, the men moved closer. One of them stepped directly beneath them. Rafiq didn't think. He jumped. The force knocked the man flat. His gun skidded across the dirt. Aisha gasped. The other man turned. "Hey!" Rafiq grabbed the fallen man's weapon and aimed. "Stop right there." The man froze, his own gun half raised. Rafiq's hand trembled, but his eyes stayed locked. "Tell your boss," he said, his voice like steel, "that Aisha is not running anymore." The man's jaw clenched. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Rafiq didn't care. He fired a warning shot into the air. The men backed off. "Let's go," Rafiq whispered to Aisha. They ran. The night swallowed them. As the sun rose over the city, Rafiq parked outside a newspaper office. Aisha clutched a small USB drive, her father's files. "This ends today," she said. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid.